Hello, fellow Tolkienian scholars. My name is Lauren, and I'm going to read my paper for you. I wish I was a little more tech savvy so I could do something a little bit cooler than just reading, but I'm not. So here's my paper. What's he Tolkien about? Tom Bombadil and Authorial Presents. Fair lady, said Frodo again after a while, tell me if my asking does not seem foolish. Who is Tom Bombadil? He is, said Goldberry, staying her swift movements and smiling. It is well known that Tolkien's legendarium is dense with detailed and complex settings, characters, history, and lore. Of all of the characters, the identity of Tom Bombadil seems to be particularly mysterious. We could easily write off this mystery with words from Tolkien himself, referring to Tom as a particular embodying of pure, real, natural science, the spirit that desires knowledge of other things. Accepting only one explanation, however, ignores that even Tolkien had more than one answer to the question of Tom's identity. Tolkien has also stated that Tom Bombadil has some importance as a comment. He represents something that I feel important, though I would not be prepared to analyze the feeling precisely. Tolkien's own ambiguity on the character adds fuel to this burning question. Who, or what, is Tom Bombadil? In 5 years of studying literature, I've come across the concept of authorial presence and intention many times. Despite the new critics' assertion that authorial intention should play no role in the analysis or understanding of a text, I find it very difficult to ignore authorial influence completely. Readers may miss subtle details intended by the author. Dumbledore's sexuality comes to mind. But if we read a text with any sort of analytical lens, we can identify the author's presence and intentions often quite naturally. C.S. Lewis's faith is displayed clearly through the allegorical Aslan in the Chronicles of Narnia. Faulkner's longing for his family's southern tradition is unmistakable in the classic Absalom. Likewise, Tolkien's critical eye on themes such as war, violence, and racism in the Lord of the Rings trilogy is not easily ignored. But Tolkien's presence can be found in more than just his criticism. If we look carefully at the character Tom Bombadil, I believe we can understand him as a manifestation of Tolkien's authorial presence within the Fellowship of the Rings. A first clue to understanding this interpretation lies in the way that Tom Bombadil speaks. From his first lines, "Hey doll, merry doll, ring-a-dong-dillo," to his last, "Tom has his house to mind, and Goldberry is waiting," Tom speaks almost entirely in verse. It is well known that although he is most recognizable as a novelist, Tolkien was a very passionate and talented linguist and poet. According to the Tolkien Society, he had a competence in several languages and had begun creating his own by the age of 12. In his early years, he studied classic Old English and German languages before moving on to the field of English literature. Eventually, he became a professor of English at the University of Leeds, and his first major piece of academic writing was a collaborative translation of the epic poem Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, a task fit only for someone truly passionate about traditional verse. The quality of his poetry is undeniable. The poem which opens the Fellowship of the Rings and the ever-famous "All that is gold does not glitter, not all those who wander are lost" poems are as well known as any of Tolkien's prose. AllPoetry.com names Tolkien as the 151st ranked poet out of 500 of all time. And the actual birth of Tom Bombadil as a character in any form was in the poem titled The Adventures of Tom Bombadil. When we consider that nearly all of Tom's dialogue is in verse form, unlike any other character in the novel, is it possible to see him as an embodiment of Tolkien and his love for poetry? I think so, especially when we consider some of the other similarities that our old Tom shares with his creator. Perhaps we can find more solid footing in the comparison of Tom and Tolkien if we look at the two individuals in terms of their roles and capabilities within the Middle-earth universe. One similarity is in reference to the time in which the two have spent in Middle-earth. In one of his many attempts to explain himself to the hobbits, Tom states, "Mark my words, friends, Tom was here before the river and the trees. Tom remembers the first raindrop and the first acorn. He made paths before the big people and saw the little people arriving. He was here before the kings and the graves and the Barrow-wights. If we consider Tolkien's state of being within Middle-earth as something more immersive than simple imagination, as I think it's fair to, we can see how Tolkien was also here before the river and the trees. He was there because he wrote them. He made paths on which the big people and little people arrived. Tom, like Tolkien, would already be there before the seas were bent, and both are intrinsically tied to the creation of Middle-earth. If Tolkien created Middle-earth, then his representation within the story would have witnessed, or could have witnessed, this creation. This helps us dispel the idea that Tom should be understood as some sort of god, a concept which Tolkien strongly dismissed. As stated in one of his letters, there is no embodiment of the creator anywhere in the story or mythology. The incarnation of God is an infinitely greater thing than anything I would dare to write. So, if we accept that Tom is connected to Tolkien, the creator of Middle-earth, but not the creator God, can we make sense of his placement at the very beginning of Middle-earth's time? Tolkien certainly wouldn't be the only author to have written himself into his imagined world. Stephen King, whose magnum opus is called The Dark Tower Cycle, which he has stated was born out of Tolkien's saga, contains the character Stephen King as the author of the novels, within the last 2 books of the series. The key to understanding King's presence as a character in the story is understanding King's perception of the writing process and the author's role in the creation of stories. While the author obviously has the capability to shape the story into anything he chooses, it is important to allow the stories and characters to grow and evolve organically too. In an interview conducted by Neil Gaiman, King states, "I never think of stories as made things. I think of them as found things, as if you pulled them out of the ground and you just picked them up." Keeping our dear Tom in mind, there is a decipherable parallel between Tom Bombadil and Tolkien as finders of the story. The Tolkien Society claims that, according to Tolkien's own account, one day while he was engaged in the soul-destroying task of marking examination papers, he discovered that one candidate had left one page of an answer book blank. And on this page, moved by who knows what anarchic demon, he wrote, "In a hole in the ground there lived a hobbit." And in typical Tolkien fashion, he then decided he needed to find out what a hobbit was. If this is truly the way that if this is truly the way that Bilbo was discovered, then we can envision Tolkien witnessing Middle-earth's creation, much like Tom Bombadil seems to have witnessed it. Factually speaking, the creation of Middle-earth was written by Tolkien, but if his experience was more like witnessing than writing, then Tom Bombadil's description of what he witnessed during the creation resembles the experience Tolkien may have had while discovering his famed land. Of all the quirks and mysterious characteristics of Tom Bombadil, one of the most intriguing is his relationship with the ring. We see him handle it with humor and nonchalance, while the hobbits are obviously quite terrified of it. During the Council of Elrond, we learn from Gandalf that the ring has no power over him. He is his own master. The significance in Tom's ability and desire to stay uninvolved with the fate of the ring and its lack of power over him is that it alludes to the relationship between Tolkien and the ring. While yes, the author holds creative authority over the ring, he did not live in a state in which he could use the ring in any other sense other than storytelling, nor could the ring use him. For Bombadil is greater than the ring. Indeed, Tolkien once scribbled a note to himself when he was still writing the early drafts. Tom could have got rid of the ring all along, if asked, but he doesn't. Just as Tom chooses to stay within his own boundaries, minding only himself, his land, and his Goldberry, Tolkien too remained within the bounds of his territory, the territory of the author. Finally, I believe Tom's likeness with Tolkien is most significant in his involvement with the hobbits. While many readers and critics believe the hobbits' side journey to Bombadil's home erroneous, Tom helps prepare them for the road ahead. Just as Bjorn refreshes and advises Bilbo and company in The Hobbit, Tom Bombadil offers Frodo and the hobbits respite. And during this respite, he offers them perspective. Tom shows them that the ring is not all-powerful, that it does not hold power over every being in Middle-earth. He tells them about the history and creation, reminding them that time existed before the ring and that it will continue to exist after. Most importantly, Tom may not help advance the narrative, but he helps the hobbits and the reader see the shape and flow of the narrative they have been caught up in. In all this, Tom performs a role very similar to an author. He helps shape the hobbits into who they must become in order to continue their journey. Tom and Tolkien strengthen the hobbits, and this continues a motif found often in Tolkien's Legendarium, that help can still come to those who seem helpless. Did Tolkien intend for his readers to view Tom Bombadil as a representation of himself? I'm not sure. Perhaps we are not even meant to think of him in this light-hearted character in such a way, or to look for meaning in him which isn't superficial. Tolkien once wrote, "The significance of a myth is not easily to be pinned on paper by analytical reasoning. It is at its best when presented by a poet who feels rather than makes explicit what his theme pretends." But part of the lasting nature of the Fellowship of the Rings is its richness and the mystery which still lies in its text. One could study the myth and lore of Middle-earth for years and never quite exhaust its resources. Allowing ourselves to see a personification of Tolkien in the character Tom Bombadil is just another way in which we can add our own interpretation to the novel and add to our own relationship with the ring.